You're listening to an episode of What on Earth is Going On? This show was originally broadcast on the radio at CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. It is now available to you in this format with all spoken content unabridged. For more information, visit wogoshow.com. That's WOEGO show.com. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Good evening and welcome to What on Earth is Going On? A brand new show here on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, Ontario. My name is Ben and I'm delighted to be your host. Now, I want to give you a quick rundown of tonight's program. First, I'm going to introduce you to the concept of this show going forward and just why we're asking the question, what on earth is going on in the first place? After that, we'll have a discussion of this week's main topic, which is populism. It's a weird, amorphous term used to describe a pretty specific phenomenon in democratic politics. But it's also a word that's on the tips of many tongues in Ontario, where Doug Ford is running to be premier, and judging by the polls, he may very well succeed in next month's election. Ford's motto is quite simple: for the people. Is that a democratic slogan or a populist one? Is there a difference? To help us get to the bottom of this, I'll be speaking to Dr. Keith Banting, Professor of Political and Policy Studies at Queen's University. Now, Dr. Banting has some pretty fascinating insights into the so-called populist backlash, and above all, he asked the excellent question, why? And that pretty much will round us out. At the end of the program, I'm going to give you a quote of the day, and then I'm going to send you on your merry way. So, let's get to it. First, let me tell you what on earth this show is all about. So, whether it's Donald Trump in the United States or Doug Ford right here in Canada, the gradual but seemingly inevitable rise of artificial intelligence, or, frankly, the downfall of blockbuster video, the crisis of liberal democracy in the digital post-truth age, or the meaning behind really expensive avocados. On this program, I want to ask, what on earth is going on, as well as the implicit question that lurks behind that. Why? Why now? What has led us, or driven us, to this apparently critical juncture in our species' history, in our civilization's history? What are the forces, the ideas, and the people that shape the human story today? Where are they rooted in our cultures, in our minds, in our genes, in our history? How did we get here, and where are we going? I sincerely hope that on this program, no question is out of the question. So let me explain what I mean by story, and especially in the context of this show. Have you ever read a really good book and you needed to stop on every other page or sometimes every sentence just to think about what the author just said? To process what that phrase or that concept or that insight means for your understanding of the world. As you take a moment away from the pages, you can feel your sense of the world shift. But it is these illuminating moments that I want to seek out on this show, to mine in conversation, to pick out from good writing and to salvage from experience. This is my ideal. Now, I hope the only time you want to turn the volume down is when you have to stop and think about what was just said, but I completely forgive you if you find that I may have a face for radio, but a voice for textbooks. Now, there's one more thing I wanted to talk about before we go down the rabbit hole of what on earth is going on in today's case, or tonight's case, populism. And that is a way to frame our conversations. You may have heard of a couple of books by the Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari. One is called Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind from a few years ago, and the more recently translated Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow. Now, I'm not going to have enough time this evening to do either book enough credit, and perhaps that's an idea for a future show, but both of these books were not just page-turners for me. They also offered plenty of chances to see the world in a different way, plenty of those bitty paradigm shifts. at least for an ignoramus like me. So I'll pull out two key ideas from these books. One of them is from Sapiens, and it's the notion that what made human beings exceptional 70,000 years ago, and what allowed our species to conquer the world long before the agricultural revolution, was something called the cognitive revolution. Now, this is the historical event that kick-started human history itself, and maybe even was the genesis of what we call human culture. When the human brain developed to a certain point, again 70,000 years ago, humans became capable of cooperating beyond the band, beyond the people that they knew personally. Larger societies could be formed because the brains of the humans who formed them were now capable of sharing mythologies, belief systems, even ideologies. Humans suddenly acquired an imagination, and more importantly, a collective imagination. And what's important here is that there are other species that can cooperate in huge, vast numbers, say bees, but they can't cooperate flexibly. They can't cooperate as individuals as part of a greater whole. They cooperate as essentially robots. Human beings have something different. They can cooperate in large scale flexibly. And that was Harari's argument. Now, in the cognitive revolution 70,000 years ago, people became capable of identifying with a group that was impossible to comprehend without the use of imagination. So let me make this a little bit more straightforward. Let's say you are a Canadian. You probably are if you're listening to this show. You are a part of a group of 35 million people, and you have a stake in the success of that group. You share a bond. You may be backpacking through Nepal and see someone with a maple leaf stitched to their bag, and you're likely to say hello. But why is that? You identify with 35 million people you haven't met. Moreover, you identify with a symbol that people may put on their backpack, and they may not even be Canadian. You've never met this person. They may be from a city you've never been to. Moreover, when you read the news, it will say that Canada has signed a free trade agreement, or Canada has a law against tax evasion. But what is Canada? I mean, we know that Canada is a collection of individuals, a collection of institutions, a collection of laws, but it's not a person, and yet we write about Canada as if it's a person, in the same way that we write about Walmart or CFRC, this radio station. CFRC has a studio. CFRC has equipment. CFRC has employees. Well, how does that work? CFRC and Canada are imaginary concepts, because what is Canada? Who are Canadians? No matter how much we churn through words to explain this concept, we cannot help but acknowledge that the concept of Canada is imaginary and not actual. And so is tax evasion, and taxes for that matter, and money, and banks, and companies, and pretty much everything that we encounter from day to day. We operate from sunrise to sunset under some pretty complex assumptions. And therefore, we trust in these assumptions. We trust that electricity will run through the wires and water will flow through the pipes, that your credit card will tap on the machine to make a food purchase, that there will be food to purchase, that people will usually obey the law and not take the money away from that purchase, or not take food away from you as you're buying it, and so forth and so on. Humans are capable of building massive superstructures of the imagination, and the revolution in the brain is responsible from 70,000 years ago for the entirety of civilization. When we talk about imagination, we're talking about story. It's hard to escape this conclusion, even if it is an oversimplification. But the meaning I take from Harari's point in the context of this show is that modern human life, which means civilized human life, operates on the basis of story. There is a common story that binds us, and even if there is no way any of us can know every part of this story, it actually doesn't matter, because no single one of us is critical for the story to be told, to perpetuate. This is even more true in the digital age, when computers can store these stories for us. So we don't even need to remember it anymore, but simply live it. We might not even need to exist for the human story to exist at this point. Maybe that was true with writing as well. If we had books that were discovered by aliens, the human story goes on, even humans do not. Now, here's an interesting turn in all of this. After the publication of Sapiens, Harari was asked a similar question to the one that this show is asking. What on earth is going on? Populism, Donald Trump, Brexit, the digital revolution, climate change, and so forth. What was his answer? He said that we have lost our story. People are rising up to reject the status quo because the story is broken. It's actually an echo of one of the major points that Barack Obama made at the end of his presidency, that one of the greatest threats to American prosperity was in fact the notion that people don't agree on anything anymore. And it sounds glib, it sounds silly. Who cares if people don't agree on anything more? Did they ever agree in the first place? Half the country voted against Barack Obama twice. Or moreover, or more or less half the country. So what sense does it make to say that people don't agree on anything? Well, his concern went beyond the cliched hyperpolarization of American politics to a core threat to democracy. Because of social media, where our biases are reinforced and even the furthest fringe elements get an enhanced voice, nothing is just agreed upon anymore. A perfect example of this is the flat earth movement. I mean, even the idea that the earth is round is under attack. And if you watch videos of people who purport to be so-called flat earthers, I mean, they almost take it as a joke. This is almost funny that they're going against the authority, but many of them truly believe it. They've read it online, they've read the articles that they seem to reinforce their beliefs, and that they know that there are other people out there who believe the same thing. The problem is that maybe 50 years ago, people believed the earth was flat too, but we didn't hear from them. They didn't make headlines. As far as most of us were concerned, it was just a funny thing that might exist somewhere and it makes no bearing on anything. But now it has a bearing. So all of this might seem a little bit silly, but to Obama, it's actually quite dangerous because we all need to agree on something if we as a community are to mean anything. Now, many people who purport for or believe that religion is the glue that should hold society together would probably argue the same thing. But there are other belief systems that can hold us together, and I'm going to get to that in a second, another one of Harari's arguments. But I wanted to say that when I ask what on earth is going on, I'm asking about story. What is the story? Who are the characters in it, and what do they want, and where do they come from, and why are they doing what they are doing now? Where is Donald Trump coming from? Not where is he born, not who his father was, but what are the ideas that have formed him in his life? What are the strategies that he's employing? Whether he believes in anything or not, what are the things that he's doing to achieve power? What is that a response to? If there weren't half the country in the United States willing to vote for Donald Trump would not be president. I mean, that sounds like almost a stupid thing to say, but if we think about it, what it means is that it's the context that matters. It's the story that's being told that matters, and who are the ones capable of telling it. So what are the ideas and the forces that animate the characters? And even if said characters don't know that they're being animated like that. Many people, again, like Donald Trump, probably think that they're just great, that they're just wonderful people getting elected, doing their business, and being wonderful. But they are animated by ideas, and our response to them is animated by ideas, by story. So the second idea of Harari's that I wanted to talk about is from his second book, Homo Deus. which essentially means the God-man or God-human. I'll spend a little less time on this one and just say that it's simply that the dominant religion of our time is something called humanism. Humanism is the simple act of worshiping the human or humanity, and it is a belief that the ethics and the values are derived internally by each individual rather than by an external source. Now, this sounds pretty familiar to any of us in Western civilization and Western society. The idea that morals and conscience all exist internally. If I am facing a crisis, if I'm trying to get through a dilemma, or if I'm asking what is right or wrong, I should know internally. I just need to spend time with myself, look inside, and find the answer. This religion of humanism is so powerful that even other religions, traditional religions that coexist with it, are forced to sort of pay homage. The idea that Jesus lives in each person and speaks through the conscience, through each individual, or Buddha, or Mohammed, or whatever, that it is living inside of you. This is actually relatively new to religion like Christianity or Islam, or Buddhism, or at least it is only recently predominant. Now, many people are glad to think of humanism as the dominant religion, or at least ideology, in human civilization. After all, it is an improvement over those belief systems that negate the human experience, that prepare for the apocalypse, or going back a ways, call for, say, animal or human sacrifice. I'm not saying that it's improvement over traditional religion. I'm saying that the idea that you must look into yourself, according to the morals of Western society, according to the civilization that we built, these things seem to be a pretty positive step in the right direction. But Harari argues that humanism is not some end point in human history, sort of like Francis Fukuyama did in 1989, when he said that neoliberalism or liberal democracy is actually the end point of humanity's ideological evolution. And many people, of course, argued that history has returned. Francis Fukuyama argued that this was the end of history. Well, clearly, history is returning. So instead, humanism is under threat as a religion by what Harari calls a new religion, Dadaism. Dadaism would be the worshipping of data, the seeking of humans, the seeking by humans of the power to achieve happiness, immortality, and divinity. It's the rise of, say, a general artificial intelligence that could easily dominate us through our social media feeds and shopping recommendations, and is perhaps the logical conclusion for such a belief system. There is really no barrier for us to unlock these powers beyond the knowledge and science and technology that we master more and more every day. But remember, Harari says, that the trade-off of modernity is that we acquire great power, but we sacrifice meaning. Humanism has provided us meaning almost as a stopgap measure with the fall of traditional religion. What meaning could there be in the data? So why do I bring all this up? I mentioned that I wanted to ask the question, what on earth is going on, through the lens of story. This idea of humanism as religion being replaced by something we cannot yet understand is one way of looking at it, one way of apprehending this moment in our history and explaining what's happening. And these are the kind of explanations that I'm looking for. They are ones that depend on the future and the past to give them coherence. They are frightening yet perhaps inevitable, surprising yet perhaps obvious. They are stories. The story I want to focus on today is something called populism. Now, populism is an odd term you may have heard tossed around in politics, often with quite negative connotations. Typically, populism refers to people like Donald Trump and Doug Ford, or events such as the Brexit vote in the UK back in 2016. But populism does not refer exclusively to right-wing political ideology. In fact, many have argued that populism is not really an ideology or a movement at all, but rather a strategy in politics, or even a symptom of a particular set of circumstances, whether it's cultural insecurity or perhaps mass and growing inequality, both of which seem to be experienced right now. Now, you might remember the Occupy Wall Street movement back in 2011, which was a progressive or left-wing reaction to massive inequality, to government bailouts, and to economic malaise all over the Western world following the so-called Great Recession of 2009. Protesters started out by taking over a park in Manhattan in the financial district, and then similar protests sprung up in cities across the United States, in Canada, and all over Europe. In fact, I believe there were even some in Asia. The central slogan of the Occupy Wall Street movement was, "We are the 99%, referring to, of course, the 1% of the richest people who not only seem to control the levers of political, institutional, economic, and media power, but whose wealth is growing faster than anybody else's. The top 1% of people on the scale of wealth are controlling more and more of the pie over time. Inequality is growing." So the Occupy Wall Street movement actually fizzled out not long after it started. And really, it is now remembered as a historical oddity of the period and the ideological counterbalance in the United States to something that did actually last, and that was called the Tea Party, which was a supposedly grassroots rejection of Barack Obama's presidency and what they saw as his socialist agenda. The key thing with that was, of course, Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act. Hardly socialist, especially when compared to what we have in Canada, which is not socialist at all. But the Tea Party did not fizzle out. It arguably went on to conquer the Republican Party as we know it today. You might even be able to draw a direct line between the Tea Party protests during Barack Obama's presidency and Donald Trump's successful candidacy to become the president. Now, I bring these two movements up, the Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party, because they are iconically populist in nature. Each of them purports to be the people, or each of the groups of people in part of those movements are the people, whether they're the 99% or the so-called real Americans, who are calling out a corrupt elite, whether they're the 1% or the coastal elites, and the people who are allied with that corrupt elite. So the politicians who are in power with the 1%, or not only the politicians in power, but also with many people in the Tea Party, or in modern populism, immigrants. Both of these called for democracy, often for direct democracy, and for a change in government, perhaps even in regime, according to the wishes of the people at large, according to the general will of the people. There is a strong moral flavor to a populist's argument. Any barrier to the will of the people is pretty much right to be demolished and removed. The problem with this perspective is actually rooted in liberal philosophy from people like John Stuart Mill in the 19th century, who believed that we must protect against the tyranny of the majority, that fundamental minority rights, the liberties of the individual, must be protected, even if it goes against the wishes of 51% of people. And that's why constitutions, like the American Constitution, are so difficult to change, and why we subject governments and leaders to the rule of law. Nobody is above the law in a liberal democracy. So a critical and perhaps defining feature of liberal democracy, which is the norm in the Western world today, however much it may be under attack, is the sanctity of the individual through the eyes of the law, and the subservience of government, at least in principle, to the individual being's freedom, his or her life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Now, none of this is controversial, and really I'm being a bit simplistic in my explanation of it, because of course we could talk about how populism really is just a symptom of liberal democracy. We could talk about how populism is a symptom of liberal democracy allied with capitalism, that liberalism or neoliberalism is really just the ideological explanation for capitalist piracy. There's a whole rabbit hole we could go down there, but let's stick with what populism means in the mainstream context. And the fact that liberal democracy and the rule of law is being questioned and eroded by the forces at play today. The most obvious elephant in the room that sucks up all of the oxygen in said room is Donald Trump, who has shown a complete disregard for the truth and the rule of law, and most importantly, for the basic norms and customs that underpin American democracy or American liberal democracy. Now, if you're wondering what I mean when I say liberal democracy, I should just take an aside here and say that I don't mean it in the sense of left-wing or progressive democracy. I mean it in the traditional European sense of the word liberal, which is the enshrining of the individual at the center of the affairs of state. Liberal meaning that individual rights must be protected, and liberalism usually meaning the breaking down of barriers to that individual, whether it's seeking out his or her freedom in life, or seeking out private property, or seeking out building a business. That liberalism and liberal democracy is usually about breaking down the barriers. That's why when we say we're liberalizing trade, we're talking about free trade. We're opening up markets, which is something that actually a lot of liberals in the North American context of the word actually disagree with. Anyways, here's where the story comes up again, or the idea of story, of those shared values and beliefs and mythologies. The reason that democracy works is because we believe that it works, because it normally works. A norm is something like not calling for your political opponent to be locked up. A norm is not using small, petty language to insult other citizens or mocking a disabled reporter. A norm is, say, not calling the media the enemy of the people. A norm is not firing the FBI director who is leading an investigation into your presidential campaign. A norm is, say, not equivocating with white supremacists. The problem with a norm or a custom is that the more that it is broken, the less that it is a norm or a custom. In fact, if you break it enough, the new normal is something completely different. The more our paradigm has shifted is based on the more those norms and customs have actually been broken or at least changed. A new story is therefore being told. The thing with populism is that many people want norms to be broken. It's attractive for a leader to do things differently, to go against the grain. In fact, many people would argue that that's the whole reason someone was elected, to upset the established order, to try something new, to recreate politics and hopefully produce different results. That's the whole essence of populism. We, the people, are going to unite against the corrupt elite, and the only way the person we're going to elect, usually a very charismatic leader, is going to make anything different is if they behave differently and don't just assume the effects and the privileges of the people who came before. But of course, the inherent problem with populism is that it proposes easy solutions to complex problems. And once it achieves power, the norms might be shattered, and liberal democracy, say, might be under threat. But it's pretty hard to change the results. A fairly good example of this is the stridently populist regime in Venezuela, led by Nicolas Maduro following the death of Hugo Chavez. Both leaders have undertaken immense social, economic, and political reforms. They have unquestionably tried to follow through on their promises to the people of Venezuela, which is, of course, at the exclusion of the country's elite, or the elite as it is seen by the populists. But the promises were far greater than anything anybody could deliver. And now that, for example, the price of oil has fallen, the populist movement has become the new elite. and they have a populist backlash of their own. And that was the protests, the mass protests in Venezuela over the past year. So in Canada, we may see what happens pretty soon when a modern populist comes to power with Doug Ford, heavily favored to become the next premier of Ontario. Now, I have to make it clear that Doug Ford is not a perfect example of a populist in the modern context, in part because he's not taking a page out of the playbook that we're all used to. He's not attacking immigrants and immigration. In part, he's not doing this because the issue is a little bit beyond the scope of provincial politics, but also because of what my guest, Dr. Keith Banting, who will be on in a few moments, calls the populist paradox in Canada. Because the immigrant population in this country is so large and concentrated in key electoral areas, and usually immigrants have a high rate of seeking citizenship, and usually they vote on par or even more often than other demographics, any right-wing leader or populist leader wishing to attain power needs to appeal not only to his or her base, but also to the immigrant population as well. So this is a very powerful institutional check against the kind of nativist populism we are seeing with Donald Trump, Brexit, and across Europe. But as you can see, it's not necessarily a check against populism per se. Doug Ford is probably going to become the next premier of this province because he's going to get the most votes, and because his message of running against a very unpopular, but what he calls a corrupt elite, is actually working. But he's actually following some other pages in the playbook. His campaign slogan is, for example, "For the people." And he says that Kathleen Wynne's government, is the worst and most corrupt in Canadian history. Now, frankly, this is a bold and somewhat idiotic statement, but it makes sense to the people who hear it because it's the story that matters, not the facts, not the assertions, the story that you're telling. Not unlike Donald Trump, Ford has banged his fists on the table for the current government to be investigated. Now, of course, there may very well be corruption. There almost always is corruption. But a norm in politics in a liberal democracy like Canada is that you campaign on ideas and policy and even personality, but you don't criminalize the opposition. Even as different parties win different elections, the regime does not change. But a populist may very well want the regime to change. This is part of the danger. And as we know in history, sometimes things happen and we don't know it until we look back and it's just done. It's a fait accompli. If someone repeats a story often enough, we eventually realize that we have come to memorize it too, and maybe even start to believe it. All right. Dr. Keith Banting is a professor in 2 different departments at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, policy studies and political studies. He has had a long-standing interest in the politics of social policy and has recently extended this research to include ethnic diversity, immigration, and multiculturalism. He is the author and editor of 20 books, as well as numerous articles and book chapters. Dr. Banting is a member of the Order of Canada and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. You can find quite a number of his incisive videos on YouTube, and I'd encourage you to take the time. Dr. Banting, welcome to What on Earth is Going On?
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for coming. So my first question is kind of blunt. Donald Trump, Doug Ford, the alt-right, the crisis of liberalism, the attack on the U.S.-based rules order, you can call it. What on earth is going on?
Well, let's start with a simple question, eh? Clearly, there's a backlash, a political challenge to the core political directions of the last generation, a backlash against political institutions and public policy in many countries. Obviously, it goes beyond Donald Trump and potentially Doug Ford. We can talk about Doug. But it also is clearly the case in Europe with the Brexit vote, which was a big surprise, with the rise of anti-system parties in a number of European countries. Clearly, there's a deep anxiety out there in the population, which can be mobilized by political parties, sometimes of the left, sometimes of the right, who want to challenge the existing economic and political direction of Western democracies over the last generation, and some of the institutions as well. Brexit, clearly, this was a challenge to a more complex regional or global set of institutions. So there's something going on, and the question is why? Where is this anxiety coming from? And there is a great debate going on, I think, politically, in public debates, but also in the scholarly world about what is actually driving this. There are two big schools. One school of thought is that this is actually the product of inequality, that what we are seeing is economic anxiety. We're seeing considerable anxiety about job security. We're seeing anxiety about precarious employment. We're seeing anxiety which is being triggered, or at least responding to international trade and the restructuring it has generated. The gap between rich and poor has been growing throughout Western nations, including in Canada. And so people are quite anxious, or there's a higher level of anxiety about people's economic prospects. And that anxiety is not just amongst people at the margins of the economy. A lot of middle-income people are anxious about their prospects or about their children's prospects. So one answer is it's economic anxiety, fundamentally driven by growing inequality and the marginalization of larger parts of the labor force. The other answer is it's cultural anxiety, that this is driven by rapid cultural change, mainly triggered by immigration in most countries, but also by changes in gender politics, changes in urban-rural mixes, that there is a kind of anxiety that you don't recognize your country anymore. And people are responding to that. Now, this great debate, is it economic anxiety? Is it cultural anxiety? It goes on in every country. And my guess is, although we don't have definitive evidence for this, my guess is that it varies from country to country. Or there's a toxic mix going on in countries where economic anxiety is being exacerbated by or is exacerbating cultural anxiety. There's a toxic brew. But those are the two big candidates, if you will, for what's driving it, economic anxiety or cultural anxiety. And it's undoubtedly a mix.
Could we talk about all of this in terms of populism? Is that an appropriate word?
Yeah, this is clearly a populist reaction, a populism of the left or right. Populism is normally thought of as a set of it can be thought of as an ideology, can be thought of as a movement, but at its core, it is a challenge to existing institutions, and in particular, a challenge to existing elites, both political elites and economic elites, a sense that there is a big divide between the public as a whole and elites. And that if we could just challenge the elites, challenge the institutions, we would be able to remedy a number of the problems we face and certainly reduce the anxiety levels in the society. So yeah, it's a populist challenge to existing institutions, existing norms, and existing elites.
It seems to me that a lot of what's going on, whether it's Brexit or Trump or even Doug Ford or the Western European so-called populist movements, fit into this definition of populism. But I just wanted to ask if we could maybe look at it from another angle and challenge the idea that this is populist and maybe that there's something else going on, or perhaps just look at populism in a different way. So I don't know if you've read the book Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. He's also got a new one called Homo Deus. And he was asked once himself, what on earth is going on in this present moment with things like Brexit and Trump? His answer was quite interesting. He said that human beings rely on collected and collective ideas that they share, truths that they share, mythologies that they share. In general, we rely on a story that we get by to get through our days, to believe in government, believe in the economy, believe that money even has value. And he said that our story is broken, that perhaps this is the story of liberal democracy or liberalism in the 20th century. What do you think of that assessment that our story is broken, and how does it square with this idea of populism?
Well, I guess the argument that our story is broken is perhaps another way of saying that people have lost faith in the existing structures and policy orientations, the basic democratic norms that have been dominant throughout the period. I would. It's a rather poetic way of saying, I think probably the same thing, that there's an anxiety about the underlying structures and norms which have guided Western democracies for over, since the Second World War. I'm not sure what it means to say we've lost our story. In some ways, if you look at the elements, the things that are articulated most forcefully by a Trump or the Brexit supporters, it's kind of often a reversion to an old version of the story that people want to go back to. A version of their story that they think has been threatened. So in some ways, it's a kind of reaffirmation of an old story, the story of the United States in its period of hegemony in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. A period in Britain that's mythologized as being the apogee of British life, which was assumed to be before the European Union. I think it's not so much we've lost our story as that the old stories which persist in the minds, particularly of older populations, have been changing. And people are reacting to the change in the story. They want the old story back.
That's an interesting way to look at it. There's another, I think it's hard to talk about populism or the populist backlash or any of these subjects without talking about the leaders who are exploiting these points of views, or, for example, telling the new story or telling the old story or telling a hybrid between the two. There's a social scientist named Paul Taggart who actually said a quote that I wanted to bring up and see what your reaction is. Populism is politics for ordinary people by extraordinary leaders who construct ordinary profiles. What do you think of that?
It's probably right. I don't know if they're extraordinary,
right.
But they're different. They're certainly different, and they are prepared to articulate thoughts which have been there. They know in the population. They've been prepared to appeal to attitudes which previous, more centrist political leaders have not. So let's look at the United States and the Republican Party. I think the Republican Party leaders have known for some time that there was a kind of group out there that were very concerned about immigration, that they were deeply unhappy, an important potential part of their base, which they chose not to speak to directly. As late as 2012, Republican leaders, having looked at their loss, said, we got to have a bigger tent. We got to bring in Latinos. We got to appeal more to a broader tent. Too narrow. The Obama coalition killed us, and we've got to get out of that niche. And Trump went the opposite direction. He was prepared to say things that previous Republican leaders were not prepared to say, at least dramatically in public. He was prepared to call Mexican immigrants murderers and rapists. And that appealed to a portion of the political base that was there. Republicans knew it was there, but they didn't think it was a route to power. And it turned out that plus the economic anxiety, which clearly existed in a number of the traditional blue states, the industrial states, turned out to be enough.
Do you think there's another factor in there, maybe a third factor, which is that the very fact that he is saying these things that he's not supposed to say, and therefore looking authentic, even when he's being completely dishonest, but that appearance of authenticity is in and of itself of value. It seems like you are one of the people standing up to the system or the elite who are preventing you from saying those things. So even if I am, say, ordinary guy in Ohio or Ontario with Doug Ford or whatever, And I hear him say things that I don't necessarily agree with, but I like the fact that he's finally saying something when this hasn't been part of the conversation before. Is there value in that, do you think, for a politician?
Well, clearly, and it's clearly been a powerful motivator among the electorate, a sense that appealing to a sense that elites, political elites, and economic elites have not been attentive enough to underlying anxieties. And it does produce a belief in the authenticity of these people, even though any objective analysis or any balanced analysis would tell you that much of what they say is actually untrue. They're disruptors. And I think the key to many of these people is these leaders is they want to disrupt the existing order, which they think has left out large portions of the population, and it's the disruptive potential which appeals to a lot of people who are anxious about the way societies have been evolving.
It's like we want someone to shake things up because the way things have been going are no good, even if I don't quite agree with how he's doing it, which might even, for the Trump example, explain why evangelical voters are supporting someone who is just so clearly antithetical to what they believe and what they've been voting for so long. Another question about, we've talked about what's driving populism, but how about once populism achieves power? So we're watching this unfold. If we identify Donald Trump as a populist, we're watching this unfold at the moment. But in the past, do we have examples of what happens when, say, a populist, whether they're riding on economic insecurity or cultural insecurity, what happens when they achieve power historically?
Well, the fundamental problem for populist leaders is that they have come to power offering simple solutions, and they confront a world that's complex. And so they face real problems making headway. The one thing about Trump is that he's an immensely frustrated person in many ways. You can see it in him. Yeah. The critical question is, when the frustration builds, are the political institutions strong enough to constrain that frustration, or will it at some point blow over the top and lead to deeply undemocratic or anti-system actions? And that question is at the core of our concern about the future. My intuition at the moment so far is that the political institutions in the U.S. have sustained, are relatively robust still, but where he's having his biggest impact is on the norms, the beliefs, the culture of democracy. He is prepared to challenge some of those norms or basic guiding principles that people have lived by in the past. You don't say you want to lock up your opponents. You don't try and delegitimate the courts. You don't try and say that your opponents were the facts of the election outcome were wrong because large numbers of people voting for the opponent were illegal voters. You don't challenge the basic core values on which those institutions have rested, or you don't try and delegitimate the media and all of the people who oppose you. That's the real challenge, to the basic norms. And what we don't know, what we don't know is at what point, when the norms are eroded, do the institutions themselves become more fragile?
Well, and this goes back to the question about Yuval Noah Harari, who talks about story. I mean, if everything is based on our conception of this world, so money doesn't mean anything except what value that I give to it, what value we collectively give to it. These institutions, really, they may be in solid brick or stone buildings, but they actually have no meaning or value unless we as a collective give them value. And so if you're eroding the norms of democracy, say, for example, calling the media the enemy of the people, then eventually it's hard not to see that transforming a society and getting rid of those institutions, because the whole value of those institutions are the connection that they have with what we think they are. There's another way to look at it, that a populist, or any politician really, has two things to look at: responsiveness and responsibility. And so, and this is just going back to talking about what happens when a populist is in power. But a politician is often feeling like they're too responsible to, say, in the European Union. So I can be responsive in my language to people who are voting for me or I want to vote for me. But if I'm not responsible to, say, the debt bailout in Greece, then I might just get screwed, and those people are going to vote me out anyways because they're seeing other problems occur. To turn that into Canada, do you see that we have a sort of a deficit maybe between the politicians and the ones that are rising up and claiming that the politicians are not being responsive enough?
The Canadian case is a little different. Maybe every case is different, but the Canadian case certainly doesn't quite fit the norms that I was discussing earlier. We have economic anxiety in this country. There's no question we have seen higher levels of inequality, restructuring, which has led a lot of people on the margins of the economy to being insecure about their future. Mm-hmm. You know, they're patching together a number of part-time jobs, or they're struggling just to get it to hang on to a kind of lower middle class life. So there's no question we have economic anxiety. It shows up in the polls. There's a big drop, for example, in the proportion of Canadians who think of themselves as middle class. Mm. The defining characteristic in people's minds about being middle class is security. A secure income, you're reasonably secure in your housing context, you're reasonably secure, you think you'll be secure in your retirement years. Mm-hmm. And that sense of security has eroded. My guess is, and it's eroded almost as much or almost identically as much as in the United States. That is, the proportion of people in the U.S. that think they are middle class has also dropped over the 2000s, and it's dropped in about the same proportions as in Canada. My sense is the Canadian drop is probably bigger than the economic facts would warrant. We didn't have the big meltdown in housing, for example, in the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2007-8. That crisis was more shallow in Canada, but it's there. Economic anxiety is there, and politicians, certainly the last federal election was an appeal to that. I think the next provincial election will be much more about economic insecurity. The Liberal government's been more comfortable talking about social issues, but I think the next one's going to be about economic issues. Mm-hmm. So the economic anxiety is there. The interesting thing about Canada is on the cultural side. Unlike most Western nations, support for immigration is still quite high in Canada. And about 90% of Canadians say yes to the proposition that, when polled, that immigration is good for the economy. Because we don't have quite the same kind of toxic brew when economic anxiety is equated with immigration. Now, we have anxieties in this country about the extent to which immigrants are buying into our value structure, that they want to integrate and so on. But by and large, populism in this country will be less driven by anxiety about immigration and more driven by anxiety about the economy and by a sense that political elites maybe have not been attentive enough to us. I think it may make it a less toxic brew here, because there's no question the fuel that has come from cultural anxiety, anti-immigrant sentiments, has been powerful in Europe, in the UK, and in the US, and that part of the populist mix is not as strong here.
And you've also said before, Dr. Banting, that in the Canadian context, our institutions are actually quite strong, perhaps more robust than, say, in the American Republican system. That there are certain factors that are embedded in Canadian democracy that make it a lot harder for a populist to win an election and come to power. The other thing you've talked about, actually, which I found interesting, is the so-called populist paradox. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so the populist paradox is a proposition. It flows actually from what I just said. Elsewhere, populists have appealed both to economic anxiety and cultural anxiety. In the Canadian case, and that has meant that they, in effect, run against immigration and against immigrants. Canada is not unique, but among a small set of countries in which the immigrant population is large enough and enough of the immigrant population are citizens and voters that it's very hard to win power either at the federal level or in some of the major provinces by running against immigration. So people can tap into anxiety, some anxiety out there about talking about our immigrants adopting our values. And we saw some of that in the conservative leadership at the federal level, the campaigns. They will poke away at particular categories of immigrants. So Muslims in this country are vulnerable to a certain amount of poking from populist leaders. But populist leaders have to be careful. They have this paradox that they simultaneously have to appeal to a social conservative base on one hand, and they have to appeal to immigrants on the other, because you can't win power unless you get substantial votes from the immigrant communities. In Ontario, the 905, south of Vancouver, the large concentrations of Asian Canadians. You got to do both, and you can watch those political leaders. They walk a fine line, and a person who was brilliant at it was Jason Kenney. When he was Minister of Immigration at the federal level, he appealed to the populist base by questioning refugees. Are they really authentic refugees, or are they just trying to cut in line? He challenged some of their health benefits. The government raised questions about Muslims indirectly, the question of, sort of, do you have to uncover your face at election time? So there was a kind of poking, but they also sought to appeal to the immigrant vote through social conservatism, thinking that there were lots of immigrants who actually appreciated or shared their relatively social conservative values on, for example, gender and gay rights and so on. So, a populist paradox. Populists have to appeal to a social conservative base, have to appeal to immigrants. They got to find a way of doing that. It's complicated in this country, but it's not impossible to walk that line. It's just, you could see it. Jason Kenney did it well. And then in the middle of the 2015 election, his successors did not. When the picture of Alan Kurdi on the beach in Italy flashed around the world, they really blew it. So, it's a tough line to walk.
So we're almost out of time, but I had one final question to ask you, and it's in the spirit of the show, what on earth is going on? And the question is, we're talking about populism today. What should we be talking about in the future? What are the subjects that we need to dig into in order to get to the bottom of this question at this moment in time? What on earth is going on?
Are you talking about how do we explain it, or how should we respond to it?
I think both, but I think we need to start with how do we explain it.
Yeah, well, I think that explanation is going to vary from country to country. I think in Canada, I'd put more weight on the economic drivers, and therefore a response is going to be to try and build a more inclusive economy where the fruits of economic growth are more widely shared than they have been in recent years, where the top 1% has been gathering a large proportion of the proceeds of economic growth. I would put my weight in Canada on an economic explanation and an economic response. In other countries where the cultural anxieties are more intense, there I think that the explanation is going to be more, is going to combine both. And the issues of immigration policy are going to be much more front and center. We still have people in Canada who are advocating increasing immigration levels. And we have a federal government which did marginally increase levels. That's a very different world than what the politics we're seeing in the US or the UK. The UK is in a very strange situation of desperately trying to drive down immigration levels at the time their business community is crying out for more immigration. So my intuition is that it'll vary from country to country, but it's going to be a mix of finding a more inclusive economy and finding an immigration program that the population is comfortable with. And the precise recipe is going to differ from one country to another.
Dr. Banting, thanks so much for coming in. This has been a really awesome and enlightening conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right, that's our show for the evening. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen again. My name is Ben. You've been listening to What on Earth is Going On here on CFRC 101.9 FM. Follow us on social media, What on Earth is Going On, or the acronym WOEGO, or visit cfrc.ca. Your quote of the week is from Carl Jung. People do not have ideas. Ideas have people. Thanks again for listening. Have a good night. Thank you for listening. For more episodes, visit wogoshow.com, that's WOEGO show.com, or search for What on Earth is Going On in your podcast provider. See you next time.